Systems engaged. Frequencies synchronized. Prepare for incoming transmission. Coming to you from somewhere in the multiverse, this is Robots from Tomorrow. This show is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, and as always your podcatcher of choice. For the full archive featuring over 800 episodes of comics and comics-friendly content like interviews, book discussions, and freeform tomfoolery, please go to robotsfromtomorrow.net. Here is your host, Greg.
Hello, and welcome to Robots from Tomorrow, or welcome back to Robots from Tomorrow, whichever the case may be. My name is Greg. Thanks for joining us. One would think that today's guest, who has been described by Steven Spielberg as, quote, ruthlessly talented, though demented, who teamed with Alan Moore, John Totleben, and Rick Veitch to turn DC's Swamp Thing into a true work of sophisticated suspense, who was driven by a lackluster horror comics landscape to put together Taboo, one of the best ongoing comics anthologies of horror or any genre, you would think someone that steeped in trying to scare the shit out of people would be behind bars. But, since he lives in Vermont, when he visits the state capital next month, it will be to receive his appointment as the state's newest Comics Laureate, not to be locked away in a basement Hannibal Lecter style. Other laureates have included such comic creators as the aforementioned Rick Veitch, James Kolchaka, Alison Bechtel, and Tilly Walden, a prior student of his. That's right, today's guest was also a faculty member at Vermont's Center for Cartoon Studies for 15 years. While he did teach comics history there, among other things, he had by this point already used his fascination with prehistory to score an Eisner nomination for his creator-owned comic Tyrant, depicting life during prehistoric times in such scientifically accurate detail as to draw rave reviews from experts in that field. Unlike the now long-gone dinosaurs it focused on, Tyrant the comic book will be returning to print thanks to a Kickstarter campaign that launched last week and was completely funded within its first hour. My guest has not only shocked us with his pen, but informed us with his keyboard, writing reviews, introductions, afterwards, forwards, and book-like examinations on such topics as Rick Veitch's Brat Pack and the history of teen exploitation in pop culture, 700 pages on David Cronenberg's The Brood, 5 volumes of film and DVD reviews under the collected title Blur, the introduction to friend of the show Joe Procopio's collection of E.T. Reed's Prehistoric Peeps cartoons, where he puts their caveman and dinosaur genre into greater context. Seeing his name on a book in any capacity makes it instantly worth a look, especially if I'm not familiar with the subject matter, because I know today's guest will make me familiar with it. Who could I possibly be talking about? Why, I could only be talking about cartoonist, scholar, Eisner Hall of Fame man of lines and letters, Stephen R. Bissette. He is on the show today, and I could not be happier to finally have a chance to talk to him. Steve, how are you doing?
Well, a lot better after hearing your intro. Thanks, Greg.
Oh, thank God. Okay.
No, that was amazing. You hit all the beats. So
okay,
that was heartening. I also do a lot of Blu-ray and 4K commentary tracks and bonus features. Well, you can't do everything. So,
I mean, you can apparently. That seems to be your thing.
Well, I live in Vermont. It's been a long winter. There isn't much to do. So you come up with things to do. Story of my life. I always was able to occupy myself, my mom said. So
that actually leads into my first question. I asked Tilly Walden this question when she was on the show right before her Comics Laureate tenure. But you, as a Vermont native, I feel like that you're an even better candidate for this. You would think Oregon would have a similar type of deal just from all the comic folks that are in Portland, but that is not the case. So what is it about Vermont that makes it such a good comic book state?
Well, the laureate position exists because of James Sturm, co-founder of the Center for Cartoon Studies. James moved to Vermont to open the school, and he realized that one way to elevate the visibility of cartoonists who live in the state of Vermont was to create a position that the state government recognized. And hence, you mentioned Oregon, and I agree with you. You would think New York and Connecticut would have beat all of us to having a laureate, right? I mean, talk about a hotbed of cartoonists, or say California,
Yeah.
We have long winters here in Vermont. People are already suffering cabin fever here. We woke up this morning to another dusting of new snow on the ground. Inevitably, people are unhappy because they're eager for spring. But for folks like myself, I did my share of cross-country skiing. I used to snowshoe. I love the winter, but I'm not an outdoors sports person the way our late son Michael was. He loved the winters to ski, ice climb, and so on. And that creates a time of year that James Sturm calls drawing season, cartooning season. You stay indoors at your drawing board and you work. So there's that. I also think, and I discussed this with a couple of local reporters who've been covering the Vermont Laureate ceremony that's coming up in April. Here in New England, people are used to jack of all trade, piecing together of livings. We have plenty of neighbors who, in the winter make their living one way. We're in sugaring season right now in Vermont. A lot of people make ends meet by maple sugaring, boiling down the sap and selling maple syrup. With every change of the seasons, there's another opportunity for applying one's interests and one's trades. And I think that that's created not just a tolerance, but a really primal understanding that that's how you make ends meet growing up in New England. You're going to be doing different things at different times of the year. You may be doing very different things at different times of your life. I took a lot of heat when I stepped away from the American comics industry back in the late 90s. Greg, I had close friends telling me I betrayed them. It's like, and to me, it wasn't a big deal. My dad, who lived to the ripe old age of 91, had multiple careers in his life. He served in 4 branches of the military. He worked for Green Mountain Power as a lineman. He took a fall off a pole one winter and couldn't be a lineman anymore, even though he loved the work. He opened a heating oil business. When I was a kid growing up, I had to go out on the heating oil trucks at 2, 3 in the morning with the drivers. Then he opened a grocery store. I worked in Bissette's Market from the age of 6 until I was 21. Even after Dad retired, he became head of the transportation department in Sarasota, Florida school systems. He was the guy coordinating all the school buses and everything. And when he retired from that, he became a crossing guard. I mean, Dad didn't retire until he fell down, had a skull fracture, and passed away. So I just grew up presuming that if I had multiple skills, there'd be different times in my life I'd be applying them. And that indeed has turned out to be the case. And I think Vermont is just, one of the doing mistakes that's really conducive to cartooning, cartoonists, authors, writers, musicians, sculptors, woodworkers. The art scene have always been very vital and alive here. And a lot of individuals build their whole year around, okay, I'm going to work all winter because once spring and summer hits, I can go to the craft fairs and sell my work. And that's not that different at all from how cartoonists and freelance artists function.
So when you got the call that you're going to be the next laureate, did you happen to have a plan all ready to go of like what you're going to do? Had you been sort of building this, if I were running things around here, here's what I would do.
In fact, when James Sturm called me, I said, no, I don't want to do it. Yeah.
How did that turn into yes?
Well, and I know James didn't orchestrate it. If it had happened a week later, I would have thought James orchestrated it. The very night after I had said no to James earlier that day, out of the blue, I got a Facebook or a private message from one of our alum thanking me for stuff I'd covered in the classroom. They had recently negotiated a contract, and they were really thankful that I had introduced a number of ways of approaching contract negotiations during that particular student's class time at CCS. It varied year to year. Some classes didn't want to hear about that shit, So, and then the next morning, I go and pick up the mail, and there's a package from another alum in another part of North America sending me a copy of their brand new graphic novel with a thank you note. And I realized, okay, I retired from teaching in 2020, but I'm not done. Clearly, there's still some things I can do. So even though I hadn't schemed the way you were suggesting, Greg, I did have a condition when I called James Sturm. I said, I'll do it if I can be given the help needed, filing grants, writing grants, and so on. I've never written a grant in my life. I work freelance. You do the work and you find a home for it, or you get commissioned to do something and you do it. To do a book, the first book on Vermont cartoonists, the history of Vermont cartoonists. And I don't want to write it from scratch, but I want to edit it. And there are some cartoonists I want to write about. Vermont has a pretty rich history of cartooning and cartoonists. Everyone from the late Skip Morrow, who was a world-renowned humorous cartoonist. Skip was best known in the 80s for the I Hate Cat books, which really took fire, were very popular, and he never stopped working. He had his own art studio in Wilmington, Vermont, that he turned into a glorious, magnificent museum. And Skip passed away a number of years ago. all the way back to the Vermont Historical Society back in the 50s, 40s and 50s, had a comic strip called This is Vermont that was written and drawn by a cartoonist named George Merkel. And
Okay.
what it was one of those Ripley's Believe It or Not type single panel pieces that had multiple illustrated panels within the box.
Mhm.
And it was presenting some aspect of Vermont history. And I presume it was serialized in a number of Vermont and regional newspapers. I found it at a flea market. There was a little paperback edition they had published collecting it. And, you know, we've had cartoonists you probably have on your shows, you know, Rick Leonardi, Rick Veitch, the great Jeff Danziger, who's a Pulitzer Prize winning editorial cartoonist. Jeff was originally a teacher at Union 32. One of his students was Frank Miller in high school. And Jeff at the time was doing a comic strip that was published in two Vermont newspapers that I know of, the Rutland Herald and the Times Argus out of Barre, Montpelier. The Times Argus was a newspaper we got. I grew up in northern Vermont in the Duxbury, Waterbury area. And he had a strip called In the Sticks, which was about a backwoods family of Vermonters called the Teeds, Teed. That's one of the things that convinced me, hey, maybe I can be a cartoonist. Like, here's a comic strip by a Vermont cartoonist about Vermonters. And the other work that convinced me I should go for broke was Rick Veitch and Tom Veitch's Two-Fisted Zombies. Somewhere I read that they were from Bellows Falls, Vermont. And I thought, well, if they can do it, you know, coming from Bellows Falls, I can do it coming from Duxbury. So, and now with the Center for Cartoon Studies, we opened our doors with summer classes in the summer of 2005. There's a whole new community of cartoonists that has grown out of CCS. A lot of graduates, you know, after they graduate, move elsewhere. A number of our graduates and even former faculty members are working in the New York City publishing arena. But we've also got a lot of graduates who stay in the area, who've decided to live in Vermont, Tilly Walden being one of the recent cartoonists who chose to adopt Vermont or be adopted by Vermont, depending how you want to frame it. And there's also, we've also got a lot of cartoonists that people don't think of as cartoonists. You know, one of my favorite folkies was a musician named Michael Hurley. I still have his first few LPs in my record collection. Michael would shuttle between Portland, Oregon and upstate Vermont. And he wrote songs, performed songs about both places. I mean, clearly he considered both home. At his performances, he'd often sell mini comics. He had these two characters, Boone and Jocko, who were coyotes. One of them was blind and had a seeing eye snake. And I loved Michael's mini comics. Whenever I would catch him performing, usually around Montpelier, Vermont or Hardwick, Vermont area, I'd go. And I would always buy if he had a little stash of his mini comics. There's also a world famous puppet troupe up in Glover, Vermont, the Bread and Puppet Theater. And the matriarch recently passed away, but the patriarch of Bread and Puppet is still very much alive. And they've constantly been producing comics and mini comics as part of their activist performance art, which is very political and very social in nature. And huge legacy of comics work there. And people don't think of Michael Hurley or Bread and Puppet in connection with comics and cartooning, but they're part of our legacy. So that was my condition for being Cartoonist Laureate. I don't believe the prior laureates had produced anything other than their own body of work to hopefully inspire younger Vermont cartoonists or up-and-coming cartoonists. And I'm hoping that a book project like this will just be an initial volume. I'm hoping it'll lead to others continuing, because one book isn't going to do it all justice. So there you go.
What does it mean to you to be holding this type of position, a position that's like a real cultural investment in the arts, when basically the rest of the country is trying to strip away this type of investment in arts and art education and all of that stuff? How does that feel?
Boy, that's a great question, Greg. And you're the first to ask it. You know, we really are in a regressive period in our cultural history right now as a nation, as a people. And yet, at the same time, we're in the richest period of reading comics and graphic novels that has ever existed. I mean, I just turned 71 a little over a week ago. There was never a time where there were this many incredible comics and graphic novels to read. There's too many, right? There's no way
Yeah.
any one of us could actually put together a comprehensive overview of just what's been done in the year 2025 alone in this field. So at the same time that we have this extremist attempt to strip away a lot of our history or a lot of our shared culture and so on, more new work is being produced of high quality than ever before. So, and that's how the arts have always functioned. You know, I mean, I'm a horror movie and a horror comics junkie, and whenever you're in a recessive political arena in American history, some of the most extreme work that ever existed suddenly erupts out of the woodwork, you know. At the same time, I mean, you know, there's a lot of deja vu happening for somebody you're in my age right now. I mean, Nixon and Agnew tried to do much like what's happening right now. They appointed their own media czars. Nixon's head of the FCC made the same kind of threats that are being made right now against networks that were not going to favorably report on the Vietnam War at a time where the protests had really gone from youth counterculture and college campuses to the entire American public was tired of the war. And I hate to use the word tired, but it really was exhaustion that expanded the nature of the protests. And that's what's happening right now. Now, during that time that Nixon was trying to do that, George Romero and his Image 10 partners, who had been doing commercials in Pittsburgh and for Pennsylvania clients, decided we're going to make a movie. And they ended up making the greatest American horror movie of the 1960s, Night of the Living Dead. It came out of the woodwork. And in the 70s, when we were still dealing with the end of the Nixon empire, the backlash that followed, the loss of the Vietnam War, the first big oil embargoes, while that was happening, a completely unknown artist who had dabbled with filmmaking, but he was primarily a painter, spent 5 years in a barn with partial funding from the American Film Institute and ended up making Eraserhead, the greatest nightmare movie of the 1970s, you know? I could go on and on, you know, a group of Texan filmmakers who had graduated from film program got together with their fellow poets like Gunnar Hansen, who had co-edited literary magazines. Gunnar played Leatherface in Texas Chainsaw Massacre. None of these were major studio products. All of these were independently made, completely eccentric works of art. And I do consider all three of those genuine works of art. I always did, because this was the work that was speaking to me most clearly as a teenager and a young man going into his 20s. The truth was being told to me by horror movies, biker movies. You know, it wasn't the big Academy Award winning films that were saying anything of meaning to me. And the same goes with comics. You know, during that same time period that I'm describing, the whole underground comics industry blossomed from multiple outposts. A lot of people think of it as a West Coast phenomenon, but there was the Chicago branch of the underground comics movement. Von Baudet was editing Gothic Blimp Works out of New York City. Dennis Kitchen in the wilds of Wisconsin was founding what became Kitchen Sink Press. The underground comics movement was even more important to me. And in fact, the whole reason I got into comics, Greg, was because of underground comics. The first one I ever laid eyes on was because my art teacher in junior high, Bill Cappy, got a look at my sketchbooks and risked his job by handing me a plain brown wrapper bag and saying, I'm giving this to you, but you can't tell anyone I gave it to you. And it was Zap number 0. Boom. You know, so just like Robert Combs' meatball, I got hit by the meatball. And that was the point where I realized that I had been wearing blinders all my life as to what comic books could be, because I had grown up with mainstream 4-color comics that I bought off the newsstand and magazine racks. Seeing underground comics was like, oh my God, anything is possible. Anything you imagine, if you've got the skill to put it on paper, you can do it. And it was really the underground comics, and particularly Skull number 6, a Gothic tale written by Tom Veitch, a fellow Vermonter. Drawn by Greg Irons, part 1, Richard Corbin, part 2, both in the same issue. And that comic so freaked me out. That's when the seed was planted. I want to do this for my living.
Wow. Okay. Going from there, you were one of the inaugural class of the Kubert School.
Yeah.
So you have that comics educational experience. 30 years later, you then become a part of CCS, which is also a comic school, but of different directions, but still sort of getting to the same place. Can you talk a little bit about the differences between them? When you got to CCS, did it take you a while to get the institutional voice down in your head about like, okay, this isn't a trade-ish sort of school like the Kubert School is, this is something else?
No, I didn't have to adjust at all. I mean, bear in mind, by the time I was invited to be part of CCS, I had already done the 10 volumes of Taboo. I mean, my orientation in comics was very different from that of Joe Kubert, and Joe was somebody who was absolutely central to my life. Joe was my mentor. He was our instructor, but he was also a mentor and became really a surrogate father for quite a number of years as well. And not because of any lapse on my father, Richard Bissette's part. My life changed the minute my dad shook hands with Joe Kubert. Like that second, my life changed. Because I've been fighting with my dad for 21 years that this is what I wanted, and what I was into never made sense to my dad. He loved me, but I was like the crazy black sheep son that was into monster movies and dinosaurs and shit. The second Dad met Joe, it was suddenly okay. Because here was a fellow veteran of the military. Joe had the strongest handshake of anyone I've ever met in my life. And he had raised a family, making his living as a cartoonist. The second they met, all of this made sense to my dad, or at least he accepted it. I don't know if it ever really made sense to my dad. That said, Rick Veitch and I, along with some of our classmates, including Tom Yates, who, even though Tom's wish was to do adventure comics, and there were no adventure comics at the time being published, and now he's the artist on Prince Valiant. Like, that is like perfect. Tom has gotten to do all the characters he wanted to do. Tarzan, Zorro. Now he's on Prince Valiant. What Tom wanted to do made no sense in 1976. There were no adventure comics, and comic strips were shrinking in the newspapers. I wanted to do were horror comics. There were no horror comics. There were those toothless little things called House of Mystery and House of Secrets, but those had nothing to do with horror. Those were, I don't know what those were. That's what the code would allow at that time. So I really wanted to do underground comics. So that's my long way around to answering your question, that CCS was actually closer to my sensibilities than the Kubert School had been. The Kubert School really was set up as a trade school at the time. I'm not sure what it is now. They're in the hands of new proprietors. They've actually moved out of Dover, New Jersey, and relocated to an entirely different town in New Jersey in a new building. It's gone through dramatic changes since I last set foot in what had been the Joe Kubert School. But it was a trade school in that we were being taught all the tools of that trade as it existed in the mid-70s. And we were being groomed for working in an industry, and not specifically DC or Marvel, but, to be able to work as a commercial illustrator, which is where a lot of my classmates ended up going, or a number of them anyway. And it was very much a trade school, a hands-on trade school, 2-year program. Now, CCS, there had been a major generational shift. I mean, when I was at the Kubert School, one of our guest speakers that Joe brought in was Will Eisner. And at the time, Will was hinting about his new project that he couldn't really show us any pages from or talk about. But he said, I believe this might change everything. And what he was referring to was a contract with God, which became embraced by the marketplace ultimately as the launch of what we now call graphic novels, even though there had been earlier graphic novels out of the underground era, one of which even called itself a graphic novel. But it was really Will Eisner and a contract with God that broke cultural ice, if you will. So that revolution that was beginning to happen when I was a student at the Kubert School had transformed the environment completely by the time CCS opened its doors in 2005. We were now working with a generation that had grown up with Mouse, Persepolis. I mean, you and I could rattle off a list of 12 essential graphic novels that hadn't existed in the 1970s. They weren't written, they weren't drawn, they weren't published until a decade or decades later. That really changed the whole environment. So I recognized that the CCS environment was going to be very different from the Kubert School environment. I don't remember any students at CCS that aspired to draw Spider-Man and Batman the way my classmates at Kubert School, wanted to be doing Wonder Woman and Legion of Superheroes. I was a pretty comfortable fit in that ideologically, initially at least. Things got very different toward the end of my tenure. I experienced the generational shift of intolerance that began to sweep in, where I don't know how to teach comics history class without Winsor McCay, Will Eisner, and Robert Crumb. But those became artists who were considered almost pariahs by the generation of the 2020s, because each of those three that I named had characters who were racist stereotypes. And that was enough for a student or a group of students to go, I don't want to see any of this. And it really became problematic. I understand the values being expressed. I share the concern about how those kind of racial stereotypes did enormous, immeasurable cultural damage and perpetuated onerous stereotypes and archetypes that still persist today. But Winsor McCay was one of the great pioneers of the comic strip industry, and Will Eisner was the pioneer of the comic book industry, and Robert Crumb was the revolutionary pioneer of the underground comics movement. They weren't alone in that, but I don't know how to talk about the bulk of the first century of American comics without talking about them. Now, you asked earlier, I didn't really answer the question. I'm hoping I don't end up locked up in a cell on April 9th when I go up to Montpelier. And your question was well put, because when my first wife, Marlene O'Connor, and I were doing Taboo, I actually had conversations with her about, we might be targeted by the RICO Act. Our Taboo was being busted in every English-speaking country on the world by customs. And that was a genuine risk that we were taking. But we were so under the radar. We lived on a back road in southern Vermont. Who gave a shit? Like, nobody in our community, if they even knew that we were doing a book called Taboo, it didn't matter what I was doing, except to the kids who loved the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And I ended up becoming friends with Peter Laird and Kevin Eastman, and I got to work a little bit on the Turtles. That's the first time in my lifetime, Greg, that any of my neighbors cared about what I was doing, really. So anyway, so my answering that and going back to that also ties in with, I was a better fit in a lot of ways with the generation that was coming in the door at CCS. Those students want to tell their own stories, and those alum are making their livings by and large by telling their own stories. And for some of them, that means memoir, autobiography. And for some of them, that means their personal fantasy. They weren't looking at an industry that you had to find your way in, an industry dominated by superheroes. That's no longer mainstream comics. And I guess another benchmark of that cultural shift is, we lost the Comics Code Authority and Swamp Thing. I was busted in every English-speaking country with Taboo, and now I'm being celebrated by my home state. Believe me, there are moments every day where I'm like, what is going on? Like, how is this even possible? So, but I'm thankful for it. I'm thankful for it.
The long and winding road. So you can have a story or a life or whatever that can have completely different feelings to them, depending on sort of where you stop the story.
Well, it's also the best advice. I got a lot of advice in my career, some good, some bad. But I was once told by my friend Dave Sim, don't go away. So I'm not comparing myself to this great filmmaker, but, David Cronenberg never went away. The man whose first commercial feature film was blistered in the Canadian Parliament because it had been partially funded by government dollars. The film Shivers, which played here as They Came From Within. Still a great and truly shocking horror movie. David Cronenberg is now the grand old man of Canadian cinema because he never went away. I mean, he just kept doing the work he needed to do. A lot of what I've been into in my, I've had I can't even call my career schizophrenic, Greg. I mean, I don't even know, I don't even use the term career usually, because it's like, shotgun blasts against the wall with different kinds of cartridges. My friends in comics think I'm wasting my time when I'm doing stuff related to media and film studies. My friends who love the work I do writing about film and so on, why are you wasting your time doing the comics? I've always worked on the things I wanted to work on. And I believed in myself enough to just keep going, even when it was crazy, even when it seemed absolutely crazy. It's like, nope, I don't know why. I can't necessarily articulate right this moment why this is what I'm obsessed with and fascinated by, but I'm going to see it through. And it has ended up serving me well because I wrote for free for fanzines like Deep Red and Echo and these film zines that I love. Randy Stradley at Dark Horse approached me and asked, would I want to write an aliens novella, which became my my second work of commercially published fiction. My first work was thanks to Steve Niles putting together an anthology called Words Without Pictures, and he invited me to contribute a short story. And I ended up doing Aliens Tribes for Dark Horse. And I got to work with one of my Kubert School classmates, Dave Dorman, who really was the initiator of that project. And Dave did the painted illustrations, but it really was his project. And I was invited in because of one person at Dark Horse who loved the stuff I was writing for my late friend Chaz Balance's zine Deep Red about really reprehensible films like Buddy Giovinazzo's classic Combat Shock, And so, I've had so many times in my life where something I was doing for no money ended up leading to work opportunities that never would have emerged otherwise. I mean, one of the things I always told my students was get your work out there anywhere you possibly can. And at CCS, the basement lab, they can fully produce, package, publish anything you can imagine, Greg. Zines, books, comic books, color, black and white, it's all possible there. And a lot of those students got their first breaks in the industry because they did independent comic book shows or they tabled at a zine fest and somebody picked up their work and went, wow, I like this. And that opened doors. The best-selling graphic novelist in America right now, or among them certainly, is Raina Tauschemeier. And Raina was doing mini comics that led to Scholastic asking, would you like to illustrate the Babysitter's Club graphic novel that we're going to do? And it's because Raina was doing her own mini comics that work opportunity presented itself. And the same goes for, a lot of my heroes. Rick Veitch is a good friend, but Rick's is one of my heroes. And, he was working with his brother Tom on a strip called Crazy Mouse in the University of Vermont student newspaper. It's like Rick wasn't getting rich off any of that work, but he was obsessed. He wanted to do comics. And when he and Tom did Two-Fisted Zombies, they had no idea that this kid up in Colbyville, Vermont, bought it from Bud Plant via mail order. And boom, here you and I are talking to each other, in part because of Two-Fisted Zombies. So anyway, that sort of answers your question. Follow your muse wherever it takes you, or lead your muse if you're driven by certain obsessions and fascinations. My only caveat is every day I wake up and try to do something that interests me but isn't going to hurt anybody. I don't want to consciously hurt any being on the planet. And some days that's the best we can do with how fucked up things are right now.
Yeah. So. That getting ready for this, looking over your career, that does seem to be a through line in how you made decisions, but also how you sort of reacted to things that were presented to you or fell upon you, or however you want to look at it. It's that try and do the best you can, but also try and be as, I don't want to say like ethical, but like try to do right by everybody involved as much as you can. So it doesn't surprise me to hear you say that, because it's come up a bunch of times.
That's funny too, when I had a book called Taboo that was intended just to do psychic harm and disturb people. But but that's a different ball of wax. I mean, to me, that was a horror comic for people that love horror. And we know what the game is if you love horror. If you don't love horror, it looks dangerous and toxic and fucked up. And it's like, well, okay, then maybe you shouldn't be reading Taboo,
Yeah. But it was a service, the disturbance. You're like, I'm going to disturb you and it's going to be great, because we all need this in some way, shape, or form. Okay, so talking about obsessions, let's shift a little bit to Tyrant. which, as we are recording this, is going gangbusters on Kickstarter. I have the page open. We are just shy of 200,000. Oh, the ticker just moved as I clicked on this. I just saw it spiral. Yeah, so that is going on. And now I need to get back to my notes. Here, I find it interesting that the thing that killed Tyrant wasn't the work, it was the distribution infrastructure of the day sort of collapsing under it. When you were at CCS, how often did Tyrant come up in your classes? Did you use it as a cautionary tale or a case study? How often did you go to that well?
Not often. I found all the original art except 3 pages, which I think I brought into the classroom one day for an inking demo. And wherever I put it when I came back home, I haven't been able to lay hands on it. So I obviously had brought a few pages of Tyrant original art in discussing approach to inking, because any kind of inking demo I could do right in the classroom in no way resembled my inking when I'm working at my drawing board on a project like Tyrant, where I'm more meticulous about it, or I have a more discerning eye. I'm not doing an inking demo where it just has to be facile enough to show the student certain techniques. With Tyrant, my goal was to create panels and pages that would immerse you as a reader, Greg, as fully as I possibly could in the environment of the late Cretaceous North America. Very different mindset, very different, work methods. I talk to every class every year as part of comics history about what happened in the 90s. Actually, the whole growth of the direct sale market, Phil Suling, the underground comics movement, which was one of the seeds for what became direct sale market, and the collapse and implosion of that. And I tried not to personalize it too much. I mean, in a way, my career is a series of warning flags of don't do this, right?
It's a horror story
in and of itself.
In and of itself.
Exactly.
With a happy ending.
But in another way, it also meant that I could talk experientially, like this happened. I can tell you what it was like from the inside. I would also, though, go the extra mile of, I used to try to always bring a guest retailer in to talk about the current state of the direct sale market. But a lot of my classroom discussions or lectures that tied in with my experience with Tyrant really had to do with the self-publishing movement of that era. And I would prefer to focus on the success stories, Jeff Smith and his wife, Vijaya Smith and Bone, Stray Bullets, Paul Pope's body of work, Colleen Durand, who was a good friend for many, many years. We never had a falling out. It's just we don't get to see each other these days, except, read each other's posts sort of thing. I would try to focus on the works that have had longevity. I didn't feel like Tyrant was a failure. I just felt like it was an aborted project. I didn't get it to the point that I was hoping to get it in time to put out a first collection, which would have been Tyrants 1 through 6. Where I was going to end the narrative with issue 6 would have been a satisfying read of the birth of a Tyrannosaurus Rex and the first day at the nest. I didn't get there. So I never really thought of it as a good case history to be bringing into the classroom, except the particulars of I could bring in and discuss how distribution worked, what the model was at that time, and so on. Now, this was prehistory to the students. Most of them hadn't even been born at the time that Tyrant existed.
Oof. Okay.
And I also had students who were coming in the door as freshmen at our 2-year program, already incredibly successful with crowdfunding, with Patreon accounts, already had followings for their cartoon work, and were coming to CCS because they wanted to up their game, as artists, as creators. They wanted to learn. They were hungry for it. But they were more successful than I'd ever been. They were arriving more successful than I'd ever been.
Yeah.
That wasn't the case with most of our students, but that was part of the student body mix. I would say each year there was probably at least one student who had already made a significant mark using the current tools of distribution, because these online methods of publishing have changed everything. I'm doing a book series right now called Paleo Pop. I'm collecting my articles and essays about prehistoric media, comics, film, television, trading cards. My good friend in Australia, John Harrison, allowed me to reprint his article and his interview with Gary Girani, the creator of the dinosaur attacks cards for Topps.
Mhm.
I'm using print on demand.
Mhm,
Okay.
mhm.
I've been experimenting with print on demand going back 25 years. I started by working with my good friend Jean-Marc and Randy Lefissier with Black Coat Press, which was there and is
Yeah.
there self-publishing in print using print on demand. The technology was still too crude back then for me to want to do comics using print on demand. But now it's very sophisticated. And a number of years ago, when I was writing for a print on demand zine called Monster, with exclamation point, my friend Tim Paxton was one of the co-editors. I brought a stack of monsters, which were all print on demand publications, to a lunch that Rick Veitch and I had together. We get together now and again just to talk. And I showed him the Rick, and I said, Rick, you should be doing this.
Yeah.
It's one of the few times where Rick listened to me.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
you know, he just released his current issue of True Man, the Max Immortal. He's doing, 100-page packages of brand new comics, and he's reprinting some of his vintage work in there.
Mhm.
And Rick has really embraced the print on demand model. Rick and I are both working with Amazon, despite all our misgivings about Amazon. They are the largest distributor on planet Earth right now.
Right.
And the beauty of this system is everything we wished we could have done in the 1990s without all the time delays.
Mhm.
When I did Tyrant #3, Greg,
Mhm.
this is how I would have talked about it in the classroom. When I did Tyrant #3, when I was working on the issue, I had to, before I was done, prepare the solicitation, because it was a months-long process to get your
Mhm.
book in the catalog, Diamond, Capital, and the other smaller distributors, so that the catalog would be circulated to the customers of comics retailers, who had to decide based on the catalog, 2 months from now, I'd like to read this comic, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't exist yet. But I got to put in my order now, because otherwise I won't be able to get this independent self-published comic, because it's not carried in depth at a comic shop the way that the current Uncanny X-Men or the current issue of Super Friends is. During that lag time, I also have to promote Tyrant #3. But here's the dilemma, Greg.
Mhm.
When do I promote to whom, right?
Mhm.
Am I
Mhm.
advertising and spending a few $1,000s to have an ad in the Diamond catalog and the Capital catalog, where my ad is going to be seen by the retailers who are placing the orders? Or do I spend the extra money to have an ad in there that the kid who's being given the catalog, because they're a steady enough customer, might go, oh, yeah, I'd like to read this dinosaur comic in 2 or 3 months. Right. And then where and when am I advertising to reach those end consumers, right? Do I
Right.
continue spending money and my energy and, drawing time preparing ads to place in the Comic Buyer's Guide, which at that time was a weekly tabloid informational magazine for comic fans? Or, do I send advance copies to the Comics Journal and hope maybe I'll get a good review? I got a lot of bad reviews in the Comics Journal over my years. It was the Comics Journal that said John Tollivan and I were at about the level of a mediocre superhero artist when we were doing
Ooh.
stuff. What do you do with that? So,
Yeah, that hasn't aged well.
or am I saving my ad dollars to promote the book when it's actually in print? But by then it's too late, because if the retailers didn't order it, you see. So
There's nothing to promote. Yeah.
the direct sale market was not a perfect vehicle, but it was the best that we had. And when it collapsed, when it imploded, I indeed pulled the plug, because I went, we went from 12 to 14 distributors to 1 in less than a year. Like, the whole marketplace imploded.
Mhm.
Hundreds of comic shops closed up during that
Mhm.
time. A lot of those shops closed because they couldn't get their comics from Diamond. They had already, decided years before they weren't going to buy from Diamond, or they had fallen behind on paying their invoices and Diamond wasn't going to ship to them anymore, in which case they closed their doors. One of the most supportive retailers I had when I was doing Tyrant, at the last ever Capital City trade show. Capital City was the other major North American distributor of comics at the time. He came up to me and shook my hands, and he said, it's been great carrying your work and getting to know you a little bit. I'm going home and closing my shop and reopening it as a tobacco store next month. Like, this is
Oof.
what was happening in the mid 90s. So I would walk my students through how archaic that process was, how long it took. Now, Greg, I mean, with this crowdfunder, which I did not set this into motion, Chris Stevens at Lighthouse is the publisher I'm working with. It took Chris up to 4 years to court me for this. Originally, I said no. Like, I didn't believe in my own work, to the point I didn't think there was an interest in Tyrant. You know, it was Jim Rugg and Ed Piskor's Comics Kayfabe session with Tyrant that made me understand, oh, you know, this new generation of artists whose work I love and respect are telling me, get this into print, Uncle Steve. I mean, they were saying it point blank to me, right? And
literally.
The next time that Chris contacted me, I said yes. Now, because I had seen not just students and alumni from the Center for Cartoon Studies, but even fellow faculty members like Alec Longstreth using Kickstarter and other crowdfunding platforms to get their work out there, I understood enough about the mechanics of it. And I had seen second and third hand the experience enough times that I understood that now in a 1 month period, this is a month-long crowdfunding on Tyrant, it condenses all those months of work that it used to take to get your comic done and out there and in retail shops into a 4-week period, right? The crowdfunding allows you to promote, package, publish, and distribute your work entirely in that concentrated period of time. Essentially, it's a pre-order window with all the benefits of targeted promotion and the ability to make that promotion and publication push as attractive as possible. And I understood it well enough that during the winter months building up to mid-March launch of the Tyrant crowdfunder, I did things like I dug through all my backstock. I pulled, you know, I've been dragging around for decades, Greg, you know, boxes of my Carnosaur prints from 1989 that I did for Peregrine Press. Boxes of the Faces of Fear portfolio that a friend of mine, Steve, who lived in Greenfield, Mass. And worked for a printer, had convinced me to do back in the 80s when I was still working on Swamp Thing. I had all this backstock that I could offer as collectibles. But I also went to our local ceramics and pottery shop, Tip Top Pottery in White River Junction, Vermont. My wife and I started going in as, you know, kind of a self-therapy means and a fun way to spend an afternoon. And I created some one-of-a-kind painted bowls, mugs, cups, ceramic sculptures, and I would sign them because I knew to collectors that was important. And that meant that there would be genuinely unique, one-of-a-kind works of art that could be offered as well. Because even though collectors continue to ask me, are you ever going to sell your Tyrant original art? No, probably not. You know, that's going to belong to my now adult kids after I'm gone. Whatever they do with it's their business. But I could create unique art that could be offered as part of the crowdfunder, and that's what the ceramics were and are. And that's only because watching CCS students, watching CCS graduates, watching fellow CCS faculty members crowdfund, that I understood the game well enough that when Chris Stevens was starting to pull it together, I could ship him things knowing, okay, this might help not just promote, but invite people into the crowdfunder. This might be something some of them would want.
Yeah, that has to be satisfying. Seeing it's like, okay,
well,
this is.
I, and I'm not being falsely modest here, but it's also quite humbling. I doubted that this was going to work. You know, it was Chris Stevens and Jim Rugg that for 2 years I've been going through bags of artwork and flat files to collate everything that's part of the project. So I believed in it, you know, and I had faith in Chris and in Jim, but I didn't really have, you know, I've been doing this print on demand. I've sold, you know, this month I've sold like 17 copies of the brand new Paleo Pop book. I didn't know that whether this was going to fly or not, Greg.
Right.
So yeah, it was incredibly gratifying that first day, but it was also really fucking scary too. It was like, oh my God, like what is happening? And okay, it also raised the question of, all right, so how do I do that for my new work? Like, you know, is this all interest in Tyrant because it was 30 years old? I don't know. I don't think so, but you know, I'm not sure, other than I was able to do Tyrant because of the success of 1963, right? The 6 comics that Rick Veitch, Alan Moore, and friends like Don Simpson, Dave Gibbons, John Totleben, Chester Brown, Melinda Gebby, we all collaborated in different ways on the project. And it was the income from that allowed Rick Veitch and I, the year after, 1994, to launch our long gestating self-publishing projects. For Rick, it was Roaring Rick's Rare Bit Fiends, his literal dream comic, right? It's a comic in which Rick delineates his dreams. And the comics medium is the perfect medium for delineating dreams. For me, it was Tyrant, the dinosaur comic I'd been wishing existed since I was 4 years old. So I did it. Now, looking at this crowdfunding and looking at its ongoing momentum, maybe this is going to buy me a few years that I hadn't expected, that I won't have to struggle and I can get back to the drawing board for a time, and maybe I can do some more Tyrant. I don't know. I have a graphic novel project I'm doing with John Jennings, who's a good friend, and Nalo Hopkinson, the novelist, called Night Comes Walking. And we are contracted with a publisher, a large New York house, for this graphic novel. I've got to get that done first. But, this crowdfunder has prompted me to reassess what I might be doing for whatever time I have left on this dust ball, which hopefully is long enough that I can actually make use of the opportunities that this may present. At the same time, don't forget, folks, whatever that number looks like to you, income taxes are going to come right out of that first, right?
Yeah.
It's not like you look at that number and go, wow, but that's going to be rich. No, we got to pay for the printing, the shipping. Right. We're also making sure everybody involved in this project will be getting a share of that money. Whatever there's left for me, I'm going to owe a big chunk of it to the U.S. government so that we can wage war in foreign countries. So, bear in mind that all those things are going to winnow it down, and that's how that's how the monkey works.
That's how it goes. But that number, man, going up like a rocket. So hopefully your slice of the pie will still be.
Well, I'm blown away. And between that and, the Eisner Award last year in November, my high school inducted me into the Harvard Union Hall of Fame, which I never thought would ever have. I was not, I was not honor student fodder when I was in school, trust me. And now with the Vermont Cartoonist Laureate, part of it is I wake up and kind of pinch myself every day. Like, is this really happening? And then part of it is, I guess I lived long enough. Maybe these things accumulate for some people. I don't know. But
one of my questions is literally, is there a stretch goal number in your head that would get you back to the drawing table for more work on the series? Apparently there is. And
well, I also have to add, I never forgot about it. Right. But, and I've only talked about this in one other podcast, so I'll bring it up again. From 1975, 76 until 1997, I lived in the zone. I call it the zone, right? Now, I had a life during that time. I went through my 20s. I survived drinking anything handed to me at the day of my 21st birthday when I should have been hospitalized and had my stomach pumped. I fell in love. I married my first wife. We had 2 incredible kids who are now adults in their 40s. Life was genuinely a huge adventure. Lots of ups, lots of downs. My first wife and I survived years of crushing poverty. When I was working on Swamp Thing, we were paid the lowest page rates in DC.
That's crazy. But
and we were dependent on the WIC program, which delivered every week dairy products to our home for free, because our income, with my first wife working full-time at a school for autistic children and my working full-time with DC Comics, still had us at the poverty level. So I survived a lot, a lot. Now, during that time, I was in the zone. Like, whatever the daily tasks, obligations, hardships, whatever life, was enriching me with or hitting me upside the head with or sucker punching me with, I was living in the zone where part of my head was always in the creative space, obsessing over whatever the current project was. Part of the reason I left Swamp Thing when I did, and there were a number of reasons, one of them was I had a dream that I woke up from that Jason Woodrue, the Floronic Man, walked into. And I went, I got to stop. Like, I'm dreaming corporate-owned characters. So I gotta give.
Yeah.
And another part of it was that living in the zone meant that everything in my life was going to end up in the drawing board.
Mm-hmm.
My teaching skills really came out of being invited by a professor named Tom Roberts, the late great Tom Roberts at the University of Connecticut. And Tom invited me down to speak to his class every year. And University of Connecticut is in Storrs, Connecticut. It was close enough that I could drive there from where my first wife, Marlene, and I lived in southern Vermont. And Tom always surprised me. Like, I was starting Tyrant during the time I was still going down every year to Tom's class. And Tom would have unfailingly read the current issue
Mm-hmm.
and said to me, "So you're worried about your kids?"
Oh, yeah.
And I realized that every aspect of my being, Greg, was
Mm-hmm.
visible on those comic pages if someone had to
Mm-hmm.
spot it, you know. And Tom was such a sharp, amazing intellect that when he read Tyrant, he enjoyed it for the story I thought I was telling, but he also read into it, what's going on with Steve? And he could, you know, he would
Mm-hmm.
bring up the thing. I didn't bring up with him. He would bring it up, and it's like, oh my God, like, you get that
Yeah.
out of my dinosaur comic?
Yeah.
So living in the zone was all about whatever my current project was, whatever I was doing. My head was still in that space. And when I pulled the plug on self-publishing, when the direct sale market collapsed, imploded, I left the zone. You know, I started working full-time, 40, 60 hours a week at a video superstore in southern Vermont that I was a shareholder in.
Mm-hmm.
But I began work there as a clerk behind the counter. The owner wanted to make me a co-manager. I said, nope, start me on the counter. I got to learn what everybody's job is.
Mm-hmm.
And by the time I left in March of 2005, I was co-manager and buyer at the store. But what that meant is, even though I kept my creative fires going, I wrote a weekly video column. That's what the books you referred to earlier, the series of books Blur, that collected the weekly newspaper columns I was writing for a couple of local papers, reviewing new movies. And I also made sure that I illustrated at least one book project a year for publishers like Cemetery Dance, boutique publishers who did high-end hardcover books, collecting new work or old work by writers like Nancy Collins, Rick Howdala, Joe Lansdale. You know, I got to work on some great projects. So I made sure I was still drawing, and I made sure I was still writing every week. Right. But I was out of the zone, and I'm not back in the zone, right? I went from the video store years. I left the video store in March of 2005. And by June of that same year, I was teaching summer workshops at the Center for Cartoon Studies. And then the next 15 years, my bread and butter was as a teacher. I continued doing creative work, right? Including a number of comics works that most people haven't seen. Every year at CCS, we had students who did anthologies who might invite me in, right? Steve, would you do a cover or a drawing or a story? Every year at CCS, for much of the 15 years, we had a 2-week project we called the Golden Age Project. We'd start the spring semester, Greg, with breaking that freshman class up into teams, and they had 2 weeks flat to create from scratch, write, draw, ink, color, print, a full color comic book that at the end of the 2 weeks, they had to distribute to their classmates in the same class, okay? Wow. And that was something that Jason Lutz, myself, James Sturm, guest instructors like Paul Karasik, we all would edit the work of a team. So I edited a comic book every year for the students, right? And the subjects were always different. There would always be a defined time period and theme. 1950s horror comic, 1960s teenage comic, right? Like Archie or a Harvey comic. Right. They always had parameters they had to work within. But, you know, that was original comics work, and I was doing it, and it was keeping me having fun and keeping me plugged in, but I wasn't in the zone. And I'm still not in the zone. Right now, my zone is doing a lot of podcasts with good people like you, Greg, right? But I don't know if I'll get back in the zone. Like I, you know, that was like kind of this weird, blessed state. And it's part of what made, I'm sure I came across as very eccentric to a lot of my neighbors, but
Mm-hmm.
I was in the zone. Marlene understood it. I've been together with my wife Marjorie now for 31 years. We've been married 24 years. She knew me during the time I was doing Tyrant, and she understands me. She was a
Mm-hmm.
school psychologist. She understands me very, very,
Yeah,
very
yeah,
well.
yeah, yeah.
And I'm not in the zone. So I don't know what's going to follow this. Like,
Mm-hmm.
money has never been a motivating factor. I mean, look at my body
Clearly.
of work,
Yeah.
right? I did a lot of crazy shit that didn't earn shit. But if I can steal a couple of years and get back in the zone, we'll see what happens. Now, the other thing I want to mention to you is I mentioned the name Paul Karasik a few moments ago. Paul Karasik, every summer at CCS, gives an incredible workshop that I highly recommend. It's called the Graphic Novel Workshop. Basically, if you sign on board, you come in with a project, and for 1 week with Paul and the classmates you have for that week, you workshop your project. I have completely workshopped 2 original Tyrant stories. Okay? Scripted, laid out, but I never, even though David Lloyd, a friend from England, best known for his work on V for Vendetta, has always told me, Steve, if you do something with your stories, I'll put them in the anthology that I edit. So the invitation was there, but I've never been back in the zone. So I never completed those stories.
Okay.
But the point being, if I do get back to Tyrant, I've got 2 stories ready to go, Greg.
Right.
That I still think are really good stories. So,
man, that covered so many other questions. Great. Before we move on from this, I want to talk a little bit more about Chris Stevens, a little bit more about like Jim Rugg. I had the chance
please.
The chance to talk to Jim for the show. The episode before this will actually have been my chat with Jim.
Cool.
And I see Jim like at least once or twice a year at shows, but he hadn't actually been on the show for like 12 years. So it was a real
catch up
to have him back on, and we talked through all the stuff that he's doing right now. Talked about it's
incredible
his teaching, and
and I just got the email that his first nonfiction book on comics is Wolverine.
The Weapon X. Yeah.
Right. But it's not really his first nonfiction book. I have zines by Jim that I consider classic works of comic scholarship,
Yeah. Like even like his 1986 zine, it's like I want to just dive into that thing and just relive a childhood.
His zine about silhouettes and comics.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's a brilliant piece of work. So, point taken.
Jim is frustratingly awesome at everything. I was like, well, at least he has some podcasts. And I'm like, well, he kind of does. I was like, God damn, man. Anyway,
Really good at podcasting.
So, Tyrant is obviously your baby. You're not giving it up, but you are entrusting it to, I guess, maybe daycare with Chris Stevens and Jim Rugg. What was it that made you feel safe involving them with this material that means so much to you?
Chris first reached out to me when he was doing the Little Nemo Dream crowdfunder. It was one of his earlier partnerships and publishing imprints. I only recently found out that it was Jim who, during that project, I mean, Jim designed that book.
Yes.
But during that project, Jim was the one who said to Chris, hey, Steve's already done a Tyrant strip that's a homage to Little Nemo. There was one class at CCS that, if memory serves, and I apologize if I'm forgetting any name, my memory is that Chuck Forsman, Joe Lambert, Jeff Locke, and Alex Kim were the 4 who wanted to do an anthology called Sundays. I always brought into my comics history class, Greg, like the actual artifacts, right? When I talked about comic strips, I brought in Sunday pages from the early 1900s. And the students were always blown away with just the physical dimensions that the cartoonists who were doing Sunday comics in the early 1900s had to work with. It was this giant canvas. So they were going to do an anthology called Sundays. And it was going to be oversized, the biggest size paper that the print capabilities in the CCS lab would accommodate, right? And they invited me in, and I did a 1-pager called Tyrant in Slumberland. Now, I grew up with Mad Magazine, and I grew up, more importantly, with the Mad paperbacks, right? The reprints of the 4-color Mads that Harvey Kurtzman had edited and written most of. And I loved their poetry parodies. And I took Casey at the Bat, the classic work of Americana, and I rewrote it as Tyrant's Dream. And what does a baby Tyrannosaurus Rex dream about? Eating fucking everything. Okay.
Yeah.
And I did this 1-page, Tyrant comic about Tyrant's dreams.
Mhm.
And it ended with him. Actually, there's 2 versions. The original ended with little Nemo waking up in bed. So it was a direct reference to Little Nemo. The reworked final panel that I did for Dream a Little Dream, I changed the punchline. Both versions, by the way, will be in the complete Tyrant book that's being offered. Jim Rugg's the one who said to Chris Stevens, hey, Steve already did a Tyrant Little Nemo strip. And
Right.
Chris reached out to me and asked if I was interested in it appearing in their project. And I said, that would be great. I would love that. Now, that first phone conversation with Chris, he told me how it was going to go. And everything Chris told me is what happened. Right?
Okay.
That's pretty rare in the comic publishing arena.
To which you can attest. Yeah.
Right. Then, and so I was very happy, and I still have my copy of Dream a Little Dream. It's right over there in the giant bookcase.
Yeah.
Constructed for oversized books.
Yeah.
Chris reached out to me years later and said, I'm working with a team on this new project called The Golem of Venice Beach. And we're inviting in artists to do pages. Now, my misgivings about these kinds of projects, I had contributed to similar projects. Dark Horse did, I don't remember what Aliens book it was they were doing, but I was invited to do 2 panels on a page, right? That they ended up not using, right? I got paid for it, but they ended up not using my panels. And then shortly after that, I got invited in by editor Phil Amara to work on this species miniseries called Species Human Race. And it was one of those crazy projects where it's based on a franchise that MGM owns, but every issue of the 4 issues was going to have a different writer and artist team, but they all had to sequentially follow one another.
Okay. What the fuck?
Now, I said yes to it because it turned out the artist was going to be Mark Nelson. And Mark Nelson and I have been friends for decades. We rarely get to see each other. It's like my brother from another mother. And we laugh a lot when Mark and I get together. And so I said yes, because I'd get to work with Mark Nelson. And it turned out George Pratt, who I have also known for years, was going to be doing the first and last page. Anyway, I get it. I won't go into what happened with the whole project. It wasn't particularly happy freelance experience, but the comic came out. Mark did a great job. George did a great job. I did an okay job. And so I have misgivings about those collective projects. But when Chris explained to me what they were looking for, I said, okay, I can come up with something. Like, it wasn't going to be like those Dark Horse projects. It was quite different. There was a writer, there was an artist, their work was a cohesive whole, but they wanted to have additional pages. And Chris told me some of the other people that were lined up, Jay Lee, Bill Sienkiewicz. I've known Bill since the 1980s. We met at conventions. I pitched a few ideas. They didn't fly. I was too entrenched in the historical archetype of the golem, which was very different from their golem. But once I grasped what their project was and Chris sent me some art samples, I pitched another idea that did work. And I ended up contributing 2 pages to the first volume of The Golem of Venice Beach. And it's a self-standing sort of sex dream sequence. And I also said yes to it because I used to paint comics, Greg. Before I was penciling Swamp Thing, a lot of work I did for Marvel, for Epic Illustrated, and a lot that I did for Scholastic magazines. They had a magazine called Weird Worlds, and I was in almost every issue with a horror comic that Bob and Jane Stein usually wrote. And Bob Stein later became better known as R.L. Stein with the Goosebumps series.
Yeah.
I was curious whether I still had those chops, so I painted the 2 pages. It's all black and white, but it's fully painted with watercolor and using gray scale oil pastels and so on. And yeah, I was pretty happy with the 2 pages. And again, everything Chris Stevens had said to me in his first phone call, they honored, right? Including the best page rate I ever got in my entire life. Okay. So I took Chris seriously when he was calling me and asking about Tyrant, but for 2 full years, I said no. My memory is it was 2 years of no, maybe more. Then the comics kayfabe segment was broadcast, and I got emails from a whole bunch of friends the day it broke saying, you got to check this out. And I went and watched and listened while Jim Rugg and Ed Piskor looked through page after page of all 4 issues of Tyrant.
Yeah.
And, you know, Ed said, right to me as part of the podcast, Uncle Stevie, you got to bring this back.
Yeah.
And the real thrust, what changed my mind, Greg, is they said, you don't have to do anymore. This is a complete and satisfying read.
Yeah.
You know? We understand this isn't what you intended, but this works. And next time Chris called me, I said yes. So Chris had a great deal of credibility for me. He was going through a transition. I've seen a lot of friends go through it. I've been through it. I mean, Taboo had 3 publishers before we were done with the 10 issues, right? I understood what Chris was going through, and he was going to use Tyrant as one of 2 projects that would launch Lighthouse, his new publishing imprint. So I trust Chris. I mean, he's proven himself trustworthy. There's a couple of other people like Chris Duffy in that arena for me. Whenever Chris Duffy reaches out to me, if it's a project I am in any way appropriate for, I say yes. People don't know that I contributed the 3 issues of SpongeBob comics because Chris Duffy reached out to me and said, hey, Steve, would you like to do a monster in a SpongeBob story?
Yeah.
Chris Duffy and Chris Stevens are in a rarefied group of people I'll say yes to. And one of my caveats was, you know, there were a few things I wanted. And one of them was, I really want Jim Rugg to design it. That was based on, I'm a huge fan of Jim's work. I don't own every zine he ever did, but over the years, I've been able to track down, or when Jim does one of his package deals, I would buy into it. And his comic Street Angel is the one comic that anytime there's a new Street Angel, I buy one for myself and one for my daughter. Maya loves Street Angel. And I always ask Jim, could you sign one of them to Maya? So I'm a big fan of Jim's work. And I also think he is like one of the best designers working in American comics. He's just got a great knack. So when I finally said yes to Chris and he came back with, yeah, Jim wants to do it, I stopped worrying. Right? Like my job then was, all right, can I find every scrap of paper tied to Tyrant? Now I've done the best I can over 4 years. It's been 2 years of work, including 2 folks that I'm going to name here. Ezra Veach, Rick Veach's oldest son. I've known Ezra since he was like 1 year old, 2 year old. And Mark Mestel, who's a fellow graphic novelist and writer, designs the 3 sketchbooks that are available via print on demand. Thoughtful Creatures, Brooding Creatures, and in December we put out a new one called In the Mood for Monsters. Mark not only designed those books, he essentially curated them. I sent him files of artwork and sketches and just a volume of random artwork I had done, and Mark pulled them together into cohesive sketchbooks. So Mark and Ezra did all the scanning. I lived geographically close to each of them that I could deliver a stack of pages, and then when they were done scanning, we would exchange and another stack would be handed to them. Now that's a huge task. And Mark and Ezra satisfied Sean Michael Robinson, who was sort of the guru Jim Rugg was working with. Are these scans up to snuff? Because Jim wanted the best quality print possible from the original art. And they were. And there are other members of Chris's Lighthouse team who I'll leave it for Chris to name in the podcast where he's part of, also contributed a great deal to the project, including some of the perks like the puzzle and the metal bookmark and all that cool shit. So I completely trust Chris and Jim. And obviously my trust was well placed up to this point in time because that first hour of the first day, that's what Jim and Chris had been talking about for 2 years. Like, Steve, this is going to happen. And all the work they did, it was their work that really landed the crowdfunding. You know, I'm sort of the old man in the backseat on the roller coaster. I get, you know, I understand it's my work that this is all built around. I don't have any illusions about that, but it's really Chris and Jim that have made this happen.
Yeah, I remember hearing about it like in November or something. They're like, it's the Kickstarter's coming. And I'm like, okay, cool. And then January, and then February, and I was like, man, when is this thing going to go?
See how impatient we are? See how impatient we are? In the old days, Greg, November to March is how long it took to solicit an issue of Tyrant.
Yeah.
That's kind of perfect right there.
Yeah. But no, they had seeded the idea. It was sort of, percolating for everybody. And then it's like, okay, go. And everyone was like, boom, went there. And they're like, pledge.
I mean, I have a false barometer. I look at what are my sales month to month with Amazon. And if I sell 30 books, 30 copies of the 6 or 7 books that I have available print on demand, that's a great month, right? It's nothing like the old days. When I was soliciting Tyrant number 3, before the whole thing fell apart, I could re-solicit Tyrants 1 and 2, right? And I had built Tyrant up to a circulation of 32,000 copies sold per issue. Now, to DC and Marvel, that's peanuts, but to a self-publisher where my only overhead was my printing bill, the 2 family households I was keeping going at that time, and 1 studio in downtown Wilmington, Vermont, that was really good. I was able to feed my family and pay the entire rent from what Tyrant was earning. So I wasn't sure what to expect with the crowdfunder. I looked at my Amazon Kindle sales and went, well, maybe this
we'll see.
But the groundwork that Chris and Jim laid, all the work they poured into it, and also the work I put into it. I mean, I've been doing a lot of these. I worked over the winter on the ceramic pieces. I've got 4 years in of excavating out of the sedimentaries of my fossil record as a cartoonist. A lot of work has gone into this, but my God, what Chris and Jim have pulled off is just mind-blowing. Now, I've seen the PDF for the art edition, and it's gorgeous. And it was just the rough PDF that Jim sent to me. The complete, we're still working on. I actually have instructions from Jim and Chris. They still want me looking for stuff. And we got really generous folks like Bob here, a fan of my work, who's also a comics archivist and scholar and historian. Bob has been turning up stuff I forgot, like this promotional tablet that Prenny Print and Litho, Kim Prenny was my printer on Taboo. With my permission, he had used the cover of Tyrant number 2 on the cover of one of their promo to drum up printing business.
Yeah.
Bob remembered that and had one, right? And it's like,
nice.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah.
I'm going to be as surprised as anyone as to what's in the complete edition. So I'm really looking forward to it.
So, there you have it. Until we meet again, my name is Greg. Stay safe, enjoy those funny books, and we'll catch you next time.
Thank you for listening. Systems disengaged.